Welcome to the Helping Kids Be Kids podcast. We are here to help parents of kids with special needs be confident caregivers. The Little Lighthouse is a Christian developmental center for children ages birth to 6, and our mission is to glorify God by improving the quality of life for children with special needs, their families, and communities. I'm your host, Christina McInderfer. Today, we have a topic that's close to my heart. We're going to be talking about sensory processing. My background is occupational therapy assisting, and my guest today is Jodi Howe. Welcome, Jodi.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited that you're here. Jodi and I met just less than a mile from here at a therapy clinic where we were both doing therapy, and she was my supervising occupational therapist. So
I know, and I'm so happy we both found ourselves at the Lighthouse later in life.
I know. Jesus must love us a lot.
He does.
Great place to be. Jodi, could you give our audience a little bit of a background about who you are, how you've come to work at the Little Lighthouse, and maybe a little sneak peek into how therapy functions at the Little Lighthouse?
Sure, I'd love to. I graduated from the University of North Carolina with my master's in occupational therapy in 2014. So I've been practicing for coming up on 6 years. And I've always done and loved pediatrics. Prior to occupational therapy, I worked one-on-one with kids with autism, doing some applied behavioral analysis. And before that, I even tried teaching for a year, and then decided that I would rather work one-on-one with kids, and then I felt called to the Lighthouse and back in the classroom.
Wow, full circle. It's so fun how God, it's so clear at the Lighthouse to see how God equips people through all these life experiences, and then they come together, and you're like, my life makes sense now.
Yes, and that is definitely what happened. One of the things I love about working at the Little Lighthouse is that the teachers and therapists all work together in the classroom. So instead of the traditional pull-out therapy where I would take a kid out of the classroom to work one-on-one with them, which I do every once in a while for assessments or for extenuating circumstances, instead I go into the classroom, into their regular routine. And if the classroom's working on eating their snack, I work with a child on making sure he or she can use their spoon or cup or whatever they need to access their snack. So it's really doing therapy within the classroom environment.
Wow, that sounds like the dream.
It is. It is. I think it's a really powerful model because you're doing therapy in everyday life.
Mm-hmm. And just a little background, the Little Lighthouse is a tuition-free developmental center for kids birth to 6. So we are able to be tuition-free because of the generosity of our supporters. And we actually don't bill Medicare or insurance companies for the therapy that we provide. So it gives us more freedom in how we structure our therapy delivery model. Which is pretty cool.
Yes, and much more freedom as a therapist to really be creative and work with the other therapists and pray and ask where God might be leading you that day.
That's really profound, and it's amazing to see the results that we get because we have those freedoms. Well, could you give us an overview of what you're going to share with us today about sensory processing?
Sure, I'd love to. So today we're going to talk about what sensory processing is, and I'll start with an overview of all the senses. And then we're going to dive into understanding it a little better through the concept of threshold. And then I'll explain a sensory processing framework that I really like that was developed by Winnie, Dunn, an occupational therapist, that gives 4 sensory processing patterns. So we're going to talk about that and try and find ourselves in those patterns. And then we'll talk about some practical examples of how to work with kids who might be living in one of those sensory processing patterns.
This is so exciting to me because I actually decided to go into therapy because I was working as a teacher's assistant at the Little Lighthouse.
I didn't know
and
that.
I was so curious about the rationale behind the decisions that the therapists were making. One time I was working with a young boy who had spastic cerebral palsy, and we were tossing balls to him in the gym, and he couldn't catch it. And so they gave him a bare ball. And I wondered, well, why did they choose that ball? Why did they choose the properties of that ball? Why not a small ball? He has a small hand.
Right.
And so I was so thankful getting to go to school and study those things more in depth to be able to problem solve myself. And so as we're speaking to parents today, I'm really excited about how you're going to empower them to know a little bit of the theory so that they can problem solve through things for their kids more independently and understand where their therapists are coming from and the recommendations that they make.
I love that. I do think that understanding theory and framework really helps with the why of why we do the things that we do.
Yeah. So, Jodi, what are the senses?
All right. Well, you probably remember the ones you learned in elementary school. Taste, smell, touch, hearing, sight. But then there are two more senses that we often don't talk about, and those are the vestibular and the proprioceptive sense. And so the vestibular sense is located in your inner ear and really gives you the sense of balance, helps some with spatial orientation. It helps you know when you're up or upside down. If you've ever gotten seasick or dizzy on a roller coaster, that's your vestibular sense, trying to figure out where you are in space and which way is up and which way is down.
Okay.
And then your proprioceptive sense is really closely linked to your vestibular sense. And this sense has receptors all in your joints and muscles and connective tissue and helps you know where your body is in space. So if you were going to close your eyes and touch your nose, the fact that you can do that is because of your proprioceptive sense.
Okay. So if you're driving, don't try that.
Right.
Well, okay, that makes sense.
Yes.
Good.
And in school we usually talk about the senses separated, but really they're integrated and they work closely together.
Yes. Okay. So what's sensory processing?
So sensory processing is something that we just as humans are doing 24/7. It's really how our brain receives, processes, and interprets sensory information. So a lot of times we don't talk about sensory processing until it's getting in the way of function. Often we hear about kids with sensory processing disorder or children with autism. But I think a point that I'm really passionate about sharing is that we are all sensory beings. And this is really how we experience our world, is taking in information, figuring out what to do with it, and then taking action. So if you touch a hot stove and pull away your hand really fast, that's your sensory information built to keep you safe. So a lot of our senses have developed over time to keep us safe and are giving us information. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when sometimes we wonder why kids are doing the things that they're doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we all have sensors, but we maybe become more aware or attuned to them when people's sensory processing is different than ours.
Yes. And because we're all uniquely and wonderfully made by God, we experience reality differently. And I think when we look at that as a gift and not a burden and look at it from a point of curiosity of, wow, I get the chance to see how you or your child experiences the world because it's different from how I experience the world. That's a gift.
Yeah, that's so good. So in your introduction, you mentioned the concept of threshold. What is that?
Okay, it's just a fancy term for the point at which we experience a sensation.
Okay.
So there may be kids who you could really lightly touch and they may jump. It may scare them because they have a really low threshold. And so the tiniest of touch might scare them. You may also have a kid with a high threshold that you could be, tapping on the leg and they're sleeping through class. So it's really just a word to describe the point at which you experience a sensation.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Cool. So you mentioned Winnie Dunn, I think, earlier, or maybe
Yes.
you hadn't brought her up yet, but I know that she's been really influential to you. What's her theory about threshold and the four main sensory processing patterns?
Sure. So Winnie Dunn is an occupational therapist that has really spent her life studying sensory processing, and she's the one who developed the sensory profile. If you've ever been to an occupational therapist for sensory processing, they often give you the sensory profile. So she developed that really based on her work that I love of we're all sensory beings, and that we often fall into these one of four sensory processing patterns. So I will do my best to explain these patterns without a visual. But basically, if you have two axes, a y-axis and an x-axis, stick this idea of threshold on the y-axis. So you may have a really high threshold, so you need a lot of stimuli, or you have a really low threshold, so you need a little bit of stimuli. So that's
it's like
one
a sliding scale.
Yes, a continuum.
Okay.
And then the other continuum on the x-axis is basically, she calls it either your behavioral response or your self-regulation. So basically think of it as what your brain does with the sensory information. Are you passive, which would be on one side, or are you active?
Okay.
Do you just kind of internalize all that information, or do you do something about it?
Okay. So the up and down visual is how much information it takes in order to register.
Yes.
And the side to side is how responsive that your body is to the information you're getting.
You got it.
Okay.
Stick with me,
Cool.
because as soon as we understand these axes, the four patterns just make so much sense.
Okay.
So in the top left corner, you'll have your registration pattern or your bystander. So this person has a really high threshold, but their response is passive. So this is the kid that may have food on their face and not notice it. So there's a lot of sensory information and they just don't notice. Or the kid that's sleeping through the fire alarm.
Okay.
And these kids are often not identified at school because they're pretty easy to get along with. You know, these are, sometimes they're a little slow moving, but these kids often aren't identified.
Okay. They're not necessarily diagnosed as having a sensory difference because they're easygoing.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So now we'll move to the right. And these are sensory seekers. And we hear a lot about these kids. So these kids have a high threshold, so they need a lot of input, and their brain response is active. So their brain is saying, we need more input. You got to do something. So these are our movers and shakers. Our kids that have a hard time staying in their seats. They may push other kids in line. But really it's because their brain is telling them, we need more stimuli and we're not sure where our body is in space.
Okay.
So those are sensory seekers.
Okay. So I'm picking up from this that some behaviors that we're seeing may have a sensory component.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And a lot of times people want to know, is it behavior or is it sensory? And so many times the answer is both. Because there's often an underlying sensory component mixed with a behavior. If the behavior gets a certain reaction, they may want to do it over again.
That makes sense.
I really think that they're closely connected. It's usually not one or the other. Okay, two more. Stick with me, you guys, on this theory part. We're almost done.
You're doing great, Jodi.
Thank you. Okay, bottom left. This pattern is one that I strongly identify. It's called your sensory sensors. So these people have a really low threshold, but their response is passive. So I have a low threshold to sounds. I feel like I hear every single sound in a classroom. I used to not be able to tolerate if there was a ticking clock or kids tapping their pens. I always wanted to take tests in like an isolated room because I had such a hard time drowning out all the sounds I was hearing. But then my brain response was passive. It was like, stick this out. You're not supposed to get up, stay in one spot. So a lot of times these kids come home from school and their teachers say, oh, they were little angels. They're wonderful.
Yeah.
And then they come home from school and they're in a safe place and they may just melt down or be oversensitive or need a nap because they're exhausted from trying to filter out all the stimuli.
Sense. Yeah.
And then the last one are the sensory avoiders. So these kids also have a very low threshold, but their brain is active. So their brain is telling them to go and that this sense may be dangerous. So if a kid hears a loud noise, their brain is telling them, get out of there. This might be dangerous. So these are the kids that may, cover up their ears and scream. If they're avoidant of sounds.
Okay, that's great. That's a good foundation. So am I understanding correctly that the ones whose brains are more responsive, that they're more willing to take action to the senses that they're taking in, those are the ones that we tend to notice more what their sensory differences are?
Yes, because they're taking action, the result are behaviors that are usually quickly identified by teachers and parents. So we often talk most about the seekers and the avoiders, but I just like to show that there are two other patterns.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
May identify with.
That's really helpful. So did you have any more theory you wanted to share, or are we ready to kind of transition into how you would troubleshoot different behaviors with this information?
I think the only other thing I want to say about the theory is that I'd love it if everybody listening would just take a moment to think about if one of those patterns sounds like you. I think it's really good to think about our own patterns before we start troubleshooting our kids. I think it just gives more compassion and curiosity towards ourselves and why we do the things we do. My sweet husband, who wouldn't mind me sharing, is a definite sensory seeker. And we'll be in the car and I will be tired from work and say, honey, can you turn the music off? And he'll say, sure, no problem. And about 10 seconds later, he's drumming on the steering wheel, tapping his foot. He needs the stimuli and he will just make it himself if it's not there. And he's not saying in his head, I'm going to make noise to bother Jodi. He's really just needing that stimuli. And so once I understood this framework, it honestly helped in some of my it helped me in my relationships as well, because it just gave me a little more compassion for why people might be doing the things that they're doing.
Yeah, it gives you a language to understand differences.
Yes, without saying, stop, fix it, It's more about, I wonder why you're doing that and how could we change the environment so that we can both be happy? And maybe that requires me putting on my headphones.
Yeah. Maybe more focusing on this is what I need.
Yes.
In order to regulate myself.
Is there a pattern that you relate to, Christina?
I can identify with your husband.
Okay. Sensory seeker.
I wiggle around a lot.
Yes.
So that's cool. All right. Well, I'd love to know some examples that you have from the school setting of how you implement this theory into practical ideas. Where would you want to start with that?
Sure. We can just pick a couple of senses.
Okay.
And then some strategies I use for avoiders and seekers. Does that sound good?
I love it. Let's do it.
Okay. So let's say you have a tactile seeker. So this is a kiddo that wants to touch the walls, wants to touch all the toys, just needs to explore their environment through touch. And so I always think of first, instead of telling them stop doing that, I think, okay, it looks like they're liking to touch things. How can I change the environment so that they have a space that's safe to touch, where they're not bothering other kids and they're still getting their needs met? So sometimes, especially with older kids, something as simple as a strip of Velcro under their desk just giving them something, or just a little fidget toy, something in their hands.
Just thinking about that makes me feel more calm.
Yes. Do you need a rubber band? I might have one in my purse. Giving them a rubber band or something to play with is sometimes just makes a huge difference.
It's like my experience is I have like this internal energy and it needs an outlet. So
Yes.
it's not necessarily, I guess I don't always interpret it as needing stimulation as much as needing a space to direct the energy that I have inside. Does it work both ways like that?
I think that makes sense to me.
Okay.
And then if you have a kiddo that's avoiding tactile stimuli, and so we have a lot of this with our kids that don't like messy play and don't like to try new textures, and sometimes this results in picky eaters because if you don't want to touch something new, you definitely don't want to put it in your mouth.
Right.
And so my first step is always, okay, where are they at now? What is comfortable for them? So if they can tolerate a messy texture just sitting on the table and they don't have to touch it, then we'll start there. And then I'll give them a spoon or a paintbrush or something that they can interact with it without having to get their hand dirty.
Yeah.
It's like you start where they're at, and then I add a tiny little step and see if that's okay. And then another tiny little step and see if that's okay.
That makes sense.
But also just following their cues, because if you push a kiddo too hard, it can really cause an aversion and they'll be less likely to try it for a long time.
Yeah, because then they have a negative experience associated with that scary sensation.
Right. And then you've just confirmed what they thought was true. You know, it felt really scary, and then it was even scarier than they thought.
Yeah.
So just really, really honoring their requests. And if they're nonverbal, you can still honor cries and facial expressions, and some physiological symptoms are hiccups or yawning or tips of ears turning red. If you see any of those things, sometimes those are symptoms of I'm overstimulated.
Okay. That's really helpful to know. Neat. Okay. So one thing I kind of picked up on from what you said, you were talking about people who are tactile, seeking or avoidant. It sounds like maybe every sense has a different threshold or could have a different threshold. Is that true?
Yes, that's a great point, Christina.
Okay.
Sometimes people you don't have to pick just one pattern. Sometimes I'm kind of a seeker when it comes to taste and smells. But an avoider or a sensor with sounds. So you can have a different pattern for each sense. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay.
That's a good point. And because of that, yes, you have a different threshold for each sense. And also, it may depend on the day and the time of day. And in the mornings, I think, again, it just helps to think about yourself. In the mornings, I can listen to loud music on my way to work. After work, I don't want any sound on in the car. So I like the sensory system because it is always changing. And it's kind of it's a puzzle, and it depends on the day. And I know this can be frustrating in a world where people want black and white answers.
Yes. But it makes sense from what you said before about yourself is you're having to process through this accumulation of distressing senses.
Yes.
And so you don't have that at the beginning of the day. You've got a fresh start, and then you're heading home and you're needing to allow yourself space to process.
Yes.
That makes sense. I love being able to answer the questions of why am I experiencing the world like this? It's so helpful. I think, even as a parent, it would be helpful to understand where you're at and how you're processing things. I know a friend of mine who's also an OT often talks about how she had an experience with all 4 of her kids all around her, and she was trying to carry on a conversation on the phone, and she got to a point where she reached that threshold and she kind of lost it. And I think that understanding why we kind of bump up against those thresholds in ourselves helps us to realize it isn't always that our heart is wanting to hurt people. We just need to know how to express our needs and be able to process through that. So maybe in the future, we can set up the scenario to have more success.
Totally. I think most people can relate to that experience of being totally overwhelmed. I think of a picture of a cup overflowing. I even say that to my husband sometimes, like, my cup is really full, so I'm just going to take a break and then I'll come back. And then I feel much better. But I am, after so many years, am able to understand that about myself and ask for what I need. And so, while our kids may not be able to process that or talk about it, we get to be the detectives for them and help give language to what they may need by just trialing different things, different movement breaks, different quiet times, to see if that helps them learn to regulate their system so they can eventually advocate for themselves.
Yeah, that's so good. What sense would you like to talk about next?
I want to make sure we get to vestibular and proprioceptive. So let's do that one next. Because I would say that is the one that I see a lot in the classrooms of kids craving movement or deep pressure. And I think just in our society in general, with so much technology, which is also a great thing, but kids are moving their body less and playing outside less, and it really affects the development of your vestibular and proprioceptive sense.
That makes sense. So we got to get outside and play more.
Yes, and move our bodies.
Yeah, let's dive into that one.
Okay, so if you are or have a kiddo that is a movement seeker, they have a hard time sitting in their chair, or they love rough and tumble play, to jump on the couch. I think in the classroom, some of the easy things I do are give them think about how can I give them movement while they're sitting. So things like a wiggle seat. A cheap adaptation for a wiggle seat is to get a dollar store beach ball and just blow it up a little bit and then let them wiggle on that.
Yes.
It probably won't last as long as a wiggle seat, but it's only $1.
That's great. And then you can at least try it out and see if that's going to help them.
Yes. Or in the classroom, we tie TheraBand around the chair legs so they can bounce their legs.
Which is like a 4-inch wide rubber band.
Yes.
For therapy. Okay.
Yes. And also just thinking about how to incorporate more movement into your daily routine. Maybe, in the classroom, we talk, we all walk to the gym. Well, maybe this child or maybe the whole class can bunny hop to the gym. Trying to think about how to get more movement and more pressure into those joints. So maybe at home, your child could bear walk to the bathroom. Every time they go to the bathroom, they do a bear walk. Or every time they get home, they get to do 10 wall push-ups. Just putting a little bit more movement into your everyday routine can really make a big difference for these kids.
And to me, it sounds like it's really proactive. Like, let's make it a game. Let's figure out how to have fun and give your body the movement that it needs, as opposed to making it some kind of therapeutic job that we have to do or an exercise. That's great. And so everybody benefits, no matter where you are on your scale of sensory input. Everybody benefits from more awareness of their joints and where their body is in space. So,
which is why I love the model of the little lighthouse. It's like, let's just have the whole class do it. If one kid needs it, let's everybody try and do it. And I think you can do the same with your family. Even if you have one kiddo that's a big mover and a shaker, the whole family can bear walk or do an obstacle course in the house, or just little changes to add more movement and pressure. I also love those just single trampolines. Are sometimes really, really good tools to have in your house.
And they're inexpensive.
Yeah, I don't think they're that bad.
I think maybe $20 or something.
Yes, but that's a good way to get some energy out and lots of good pressure into your joints.
What about hugs?
Oh, lots of hugs. Yes, I love bear hugs and deep squeezes, and just thinking about putting pressure into the major joints. So like if I'm giving a kid deep pressure, pressing on their shoulders or pressing, but one hand below and one hand above their elbow, pressing together. So think about the
like
big...
at a right angle?
Yes.
Okay.
So think about the big joints and then think about pushing into them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of squeezing them together.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you just feel the kid out. There's really not a prescription that fits every kid. Sometimes I kind of start with 3 on their shoulders and see how their body responds. And sometimes their whole body relaxes.
Yeah. And then you can empower them to be able to express, I need a hug.
Yes.
Or can I go for a run? Or kind of figure out how they can get what they need in a constructive way.
Yes, I love that. Once they've calmed down, I think it's really important to add language to, it looks like your body feels calmer. Just start to teach those emotions with the action so that they can eventually advocate for what they need.
Yes, that's perfect. Well, Jodi, this has been awesome.
Oh, good. I hope it gave everybody a few good ideas.
Yes. Do you have any parting thoughts that you would want to share to parents or educators in a school setting to just encourage them in helping kids, or maybe even just keeping that positive perspective you shared at the beginning about how we all have senses?
Yes. I just think that it's really important, like I've said a couple times, to take a mindset of curiosity and stop labeling behaviors as good or bad, but just let's be curious as to what they're trying to communicate to us, because their brain is telling their body to do something, and it may not be their choice. And I didn't choose to have a brain that can constantly hear a clock ticking. I didn't choose that, and somebody telling me to get over it is not helpful because I still hear it. So just coming from that place of curiosity and compassion, first for yourself and then obviously for your children, to figure out why they're doing the things that they do.
One of my heroes in bonding with kids is Barbara Sorrells, and she always says, trust the reality of the child.
Oh, I love that.
There's so much grace in that.
Yes. And it's a gift to get a little glimpse into somebody else's reality.
Okay. Well, thanks for being on the show
You're
today.
welcome.
I have
Thanks for having me.
Final question for you. Jodi, what does it mean to you to help kids be kids?
I think it means, the gift of being able to witness, be a witness and be a participant in the beautiful life that God gave them. To not always try and change them, but instead learn from them.
So good. I love your heart, Jodi.
Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider joining the crew, a passionate and determined group of monthly givers on mission to discover solutions that change the future of kids with special needs. To learn more about the Little Lighthouse, please explore www.littlelighthouse.org. Until next time, enjoy your kids.